this segment is Gad Saad. He is an evolutionary behavioral scientist at the John Molson School of Business. He's the author of several books on the topic, including The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, for Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. Gad, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, Chuck.
Gad, what exactly is evolutionary consumption?
So evolutionary consumption is basically the idea that to truly understand consumer behavior, we have to understand the evolutionary forces and biological forces that have shaped human minds and human bodies. Much of the work in consumers' behavior has traditionally argued that we transcend our biology. What makes us human is that the evolutionary forces that define how the mosquito and the zebra and the giraffe behave somehow don't apply to humans. And what I basically argue is that, of course, culture matters, of course, the environment matters, but we also can't negate the fact that our biology shapes much what we do as consumers.
You know, Gad, I certainly understand, and I'm not a scientist here, but I understand the biological and genetic aspect of what you're talking about, which is that there are certain tendencies that are hardwired into us genetically that give us various predispositions towards certain things. An example that I've occasionally heard about this is that people who are Irish have a tendency to avoid alcohol because they believe, and I think there's some basis for it, that based on their heredity and genetic predisposition, there might be a tendency toward a weakness for alcohol, that they could become alcoholics. So as a result, they simply they avoid it altogether. But where I lose you is the evolutionary aspect to it, which implies that there is a certain amount of breeding going on with regard to these dispositions, and that as such, you know, there's a process of evolving, which is to say becoming superior. Right.
That's not what evolutionary theory says. So evolution doesn't work in a manner that seeks to perfect an organism. Evolution simply uses a selection mechanism such that traits that are maximally adaptive to a particular environment are selected. And so let me give you a concrete example. We might ask, are there any sex differences when it comes to consumer behavior that manifest themselves in exactly the same way across all known cultures? And the answer is yes. And therefore, that gives you sort of an indication that it can't necessarily be due to culture, because if there are 1,000 different cultures that are radically different from one another, where a phenomenon manifests itself in exactly the same way across time and place, then the argument is there must be some biological explanation for this phenomenon. So to give you a concrete example, if we look at, say, pornography, there is no culture that's ever been uncovered where women are the greater consumers of porn than men are. Now, this doesn't mean that we have a gene for pornography. Rather, what this argues is that pornography piggybacks on specific aspects of male physiology that are not necessarily as prevalent in women. So it has nothing to do with being superior or with perfecting humans. It has to do with taking evolutionary principles and seeing how they manifest themselves within the consumer realm.
Well, I mean, again, I think what you're talking about here are genetic principles and biological principles. And clearly, though, you know, there's a different genetic makeup between men and women that's observable in nature. And
right.
As such, you know, those differences are various and complex different responses to various phenomena in nature and otherwise. But I don't think that I just think that the word evolution might be misplaced in that there's no evidence that therefore what is emerging here is a new species, an evolved entity which pops out after umpteen billion years of breeding, which is the Darwinian theory. I think that it has more to do with a simple observation that our genes, as it were, very well may play a role in our behavior. And, it's an interesting, I suppose, preposition for marketers who are seeking to find markets for their various products and services.
Exactly right. So let me give you a couple of examples. If a marketer doesn't have a good understanding of human nature, he or she will likely create products that will ultimately fail in the marketplace. So, very concrete example. A few years ago, a company a publisher that specializes in romance novels, the name escapes me. So romance novels are largely read by women around the world. And it turns out that the archetype of the male hero in romance novels, irrespective of the culture, so it could be in Egypt or in Romania or in Boston, Massachusetts, the archetype of the male hero in romance novels is always roughly the same. He's tall, he's a neurosurgeon, he's a prince, he wrestles alligators on his six-pack stomach. And so this company decided that, we want to get rid of these, quote, antiquated sexist stereotypes. We'd like to create a new definition of masculinity where the guy is sensitive, where he cries, where he goes into fetal positions, right? Guess what happened to that romance novel line? It didn't work.
Exactly. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen
what you're talking about is...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, please. Continue.
Yeah, so it didn't work precisely because the starting point of that publisher's premise is an erroneous one, because it argues that humans are infinitely malleable, their brains are open to all forms of socialization, and as long as you teach them whatever it is that you wish to teach them, they will learn and behave accordingly. And the answer to that is obviously no. So if you take, for example, in a completely different context, food offerings, the top 10 restaurants around the world have one thing in common. They deliver fatty, high-caloric, tasty foods to us. Now, if I gave you $10 billion advertising budget to sell raw celery and grass juice, you would fail because that particular product offering is not consistent, is not congruent with my evolved taste buds. So again, from a marketer's perspective, understanding the biological and evolutionary forces that have shaped our minds and bodies is a very practical endeavor.
So basically, you're running, I suppose, contrary to much of the teaching of our sort of modern feminist establishment, for one thing, but in a more broad sense, a Marxian point of view, which is that all of these things are created by those who want to exploit us.
Absolutely, I'm running against them. And I mean, one of the challenges, but also one of the exciting things about the work that I do is that it riles up all sorts of people, right? So, religious folks will get angry about evolutionary theory for obvious reasons, right? So where is God in the mix? Radical feminists will get upset at evolutionary theory because they can't concede the point that there might be innate biological differences between the sexes. Not that one sex is superior than the other, but rather that each of the sexes would have evolved somewhat different realities. Social constructivists, these are social scientists who argue that everything is due to socialization, will get very upset because, again, they think that to biologize human behavior is very genetically deterministic. Postmodernists will hate my work because they believe that everything is relative, there are no universals. So there's a whole slew of people who will get very, very upset about evolutionary theorizing, none of which has anything to do with scientific validity on their part, but it's because it attacks their pet political ideology.
Well, I mean, I suppose that maybe I fall in that camp in my objection to the term evolution to describe your work. I think that oftentimes evolutionary theory is confused with, good old-fashioned, genetics, which I think is a legitimate science.
Well, I mean, not that I wish to be as polite as possible on your show, but evolution as a scientific explanation is perhaps the theory that has received the most evidence in the history of human thought. So, in other words, there is no working biologist today at any university in North America that is unsure whether evolution is true or not. So, in other words, to question evolution is literally tantamount to questioning gravity or questioning whether the Earth is round. Now, what we can disagree about is specific mechanisms of evolution. So, evolutionary scientists engage in very heated debates about whether this type of genetic transmission is operating or not. But the idea as to whether evolution is the mechanism that explains biological diversity, no serious scientist questions that.
I disagree with you. I think a lot of scientists question it, and there's no proof that one species evolves into a superior species, which is what the evolutionary theory is. But there is certainly a lot of proof with regard to genetic predispositions of people, and that genetics, I suppose that, that it does play a role in our impulses. I guess that to understand that does not in any way negate the fact, the religious understanding or the moralistic understanding, which is that one of our responsibilities as conscious human beings with characters is to restrain ourselves from those genetic or behavioral tendencies if they are unconstructive.
Right. So a couple of points there that you mentioned. So one, there are some scientists who are able to reconcile their scientific work and their religious faith, and usually they do that by arguing that sure, evolution is a veridical mechanism, but it is so exquisite and beautiful that it is a manifestation of the divine. So that's one way by which, and the classic example of such a position is Francis Collins, who I think was appointed by Barack Obama to head the National Institutes of Health. So he's a very...
Thanks so much. My guest is Gad Saad. He's an evolutionary behavioral scientist at the John Molson School of Business. We're talking about genetics, really, and its influence on us. Gad, I do think that obviously we're genetic beings. We have an animal side to us. We're made up of flesh and bones. I mean, we have cells and all of that, just like animals have. But the element that makes us distinct is the fact that we develop our character and we develop our abilities, and based upon our embrace of various principles. And that is something that actually is evolutionary in the real sense, not in the biological sense, in that we as individuals and I suppose as societies evolve by embracing certain principles that enhance human life on Earth. And those are both scientific, but they're also political and societal. But a lot of your research, I mean, you seem to indicate that we can become captive by our genetic makeup. And while I think that's certainly true with regard to the difference between men and women, I'm not sure it's true with regard to behavior.
So let me give you maybe a few examples. And actually it's not true that we are captive to our genetic predispositions, because there's always an interaction between our genes and the environment. As a matter of fact, genes themselves get turned on or turned off as a result of an environmental input. So everything that we are, so you're partly correct in that everything that we are is really an inextricable mix of our environment and our biology. They're always working in tandem. So let me give you another concrete example. So a few years ago, I did a study with one of my former doctoral students where we looked at how do women's behaviors change as a function of where they are in their menstrual cycle. The idea being that, of course, a woman's hormonal profile shifts radically depending on whether she is in the ovulatory phase or the non-ovulatory phase. And so we looked at several things, but I'll mention one for the current purposes. We looked at how likely is a woman to beautify herself, dress sexily, wear makeup, wear high heels, beautify herself as a function of where she is in the menstrual cycle. And it turns out, not surprisingly from a biological and Darwinian perspective, that when a woman is in the ovulatory phase of her cycle, this is when she's most likely to engage in sexual signaling. And this is a behavior that is found across countless mammalian species. Now, other females in other species will do it differently. So, for example, female chimps will send out olfactory signals that makes it exciting for men to smell them, males to smell them, or their genitalia will become engorged. Now, thankfully, in the human case, that's not quite what women do, but yet here's a demonstration of how a evolved mechanism, a hormonal mechanism, is shaping women's behaviors in the marketplace, not consciously, right? It's not as though a woman is saying, oh, gee, I'm ovulating, let me dress sexily. But ultimately, that's what happens. So here's an example where you're taking an evolutionary mechanism and demonstrating how it manifests itself in a consumer setting.
No, I think that's interesting. I mean, as a personal anecdote, I mean, I'm a husband of a woman and a father of a daughter. So I mean, I kind of, exactly. I can observe some of this. But when you talk about the influence, the individuals being influenced by either the genetic makeup or the environment, I mean, again, I think you're leaving out the third component here, which is their character, which is the embrace, the conscious embrace by the human being of various principles and the rejection of others, and that's what makes us different than animals, which are strictly tied to the environment and their genetics, and they're totally emotional beings that are auto-responsive to environmental stimuli. Whereas as human beings, we have what's called reason. We have a conscience. We have the ability to discern morality. Now, you talk about in one of your points of conversation, you do get into you say, why is religion the most successful product ever devised? I think that am I wrong to suggest that there hasn't been some research that indicate that there is something hardwired about a belief in a creator of the universe that's
right?
Divine,
that's a great question. There is actually research that has looked at what are the, if you like, evolutionary roots of religion. So rather than pitting, let's say, evolution against religion, some scientists argue to the extent that religion is such an important element of the human condition, might there be some evolutionary arguments as to why, most of us are prone to being a believer. And here there's a couple of arguments. So the classic argument that's been proposed by an evolutionary biologist by the name of David Sloan Wilson, he uses what's called a group selectionist argument. He argues that groups that are high on religiosity tend to, if you like, out-survive groups that are not. The first guy to propose such a functional argument, or maybe not the first guy, but a famous guy, was Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, who basically argued that it doesn't make sense to not believe in God because, if you like, from a game theoretic perspective, it's always more optimal to believe than to not believe. But again,
interesting.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, interesting, and I think that the only issue I might look at there is that a belief in God is not necessarily a communal thing. It's something that actually I would imagine transcends that. It's more of an inherent thing. It's something that is ingrained in the infant. There's been a study done that indicate that even the infant believes in a creator, and if anything, the communal aspect of it, and that's what might lead to a greater happiness. The communal aspect of it, on the other hand, to a certain degree, could be influenced by societies. If you have religions that, in the name of God, blow up the World Trade Center, you've got, sets of values that then can be evaluated that were created at some point by people.
Right. Now, here's the issue, though. Two points to what you're saying. Number one, there are roughly 10,000 documented religions in world history, many of which prescribe perfectly contradictory positions on everything under the sun. So one would have to decide which is the, quote, true creator. And secondly, one would have to explain why there have been a tremendous number of truly accomplished people throughout history who have not believed in a personal deity or a creator. So are they somehow outside the normal realm of the human condition, right? So I don't think that, I think we have a predisposition to look for patterns in the world, and to the extent that religion offers us a way to understand patterns, then it has served the purpose. But of course, there's the argument of God in the gaps, right? The number of things that were ascribed to religion 500 years ago compared to today is much, much smaller, right? God keeps hiding further and further in more minute gaps. So, maybe that's a discussion for another time, but I'm not sure that we are sort of doomed to be believers.
Okay. I mean, it's just an interesting question. I mean, it seems to me to be somewhat hardwired, but yet the actual belief particulars are something that's much more based upon character assessment. Do you think that same-sex attraction is genetic?
I do. So you mean, are you talking about whether it is innate or a choice? Is that your general question?
Right. Is it, or not necessarily a choice, but more of a preference or a psychological question as opposed to something that's a genetic thing, that people are born, with a gay gene or something like that?
Well, it's not. To answer that it is innate doesn't necessarily mean that there is a, quote, gay gene. It simply says that in the same way that we are born with phenotypic traits like what our eye color is, I think that we're also born with different sexual orientations. Now, most people will be attracted to opposite sex targets, but in much smaller number of people, they'll be attracted to same-sex targets. Incidentally, there have been evolutionary arguments for why homosexuality exists. But this is one example, by the way, where evolutionary scientists are very split.
The work of the biologist, of the geneticist, is to try to determine through scientific means what is inbred, what is we are born with, versus what we learn or what we embrace, and what we accept consciously. And with regard to same-sex attraction, I would think that if you accept the Darwinian theory, you would have to conclude that homosexuality would be extremely rare in the world today, possibly extinct, other than people who are actually physically born with two genders, that is like a hermaphrodite, because the homosexual over time and over generations is less likely to reproduce. Is less likely to mate with the opposite sex.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
No, that is my thought.
Oh, okay. So there is an argument that it hasn't yet bore out. The data doesn't yet fully support it. It's based on a mechanism known as kin selection. So, for example, when you're trying to extend your genes, you could either do it through reproduction. So you and I have children that on average share 50% of their genes with us. So that's called direct fitness. Or I could also extend my genes by investing in those who are related to me. So the fact that I love my nephews and nieces and uncles and parents, that's an indirect way by which I could, if you'd like, extend my genes. So one argument for why homosexuality might persist is that gay individuals might still not be in a Darwinian, if you like, reproductive dead end if they, on average, invest a lot in their kin. In other words, they could still be extending their genes through this indirect means. So theoretically,
it's a fluid situation. People's sexuality change at different times for different reasons, and it has to do with not necessarily the environment, but maybe there wasn't a proper bonding for the young man or the young woman with the same sex at an early age. I mean, that's the classic psychological examination of it. But it gets into, at the same time, I think religions are wrong to say that it's evil and, that it's an abomination. In fact, that's a misinterpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which does not use the word abomination. So, I guess that we're talking in this case about something that, the biological element of it to determine that is very important. And I think that people are jumping the gun by assuming that there is something biological.
So you think it's environmental?
Not environmental. I think it's psychological more. It's nothing in the environment that causes it.
Our
I think
psychology
it's
doesn't
the
exist
development
outside
of the
our
young.
brains. Hello?
Well, if you take a look at every society in history, both primitive and modern, there is a process by which the young man and the young woman is acculturated toward identification of their gender. And there's something, I think, that interrupts that. And it's not just manifested in same-sex attraction. It's manifested in other sexual aspects as well, like promiscuity and other things. There was something that interrupted the regular conventional development of the man and the woman. And
well,
it can be therefore addressed
there is some scientific evidence that speaks to a developmental mechanism, but in utero. In other words, there is some research that has looked at the extent to which a boy or a girl is exposed to testosterone in utero could potentially affect a wide range of phenomena, including sexual orientation. So you're partly right in using the term developmental, but not necessarily outside the womb.
Right. No, that's interesting, but that also doesn't therefore call into question the basic genetic question. It's that would be an environmental situation in that case.
And that speaks to the fact that everything, that's exactly the point, right? I mean, the environment doesn't exist outside our biology. That's why I said originally that everything is an inextricable mix of our genes and our biology and our unique upbringings. It's really this hodgepodge of factors, and oftentimes it's very, very difficult to disentangle these.
Oh, I know it, but I think that if one does look at the environmental aspect of what's influenced us, which is obviously true, if somebody is born in Boston, where I am, they might have a different outlook on the world than if they were born in Borneo. But even so, if those are things that the individual can overcome through education and through experience and the development of character.
Well, I mean, I met once a guy who thought that you could pray your gay away by reading Talmudic scripts. Now, I'm not a fan of that intervention strategy. You see what I'm saying?
No, I don't think that's. I'm not either, but I think that psychology is a possibility that should be made available to people as a way of exploring what happened to them as children and how it is that, what was their development as a young man or as a young woman with regard to the same sex. It's just something that should be made.
The APA got rid of that idea. So I think in 1973, homosexuality was no longer considered something that you had to, quote, cure. So, very sophisticated behavioral scientists, psychiatrists, and psychologists are certainly not in your camp. They're arguing that there is nothing to fix, right? You're born that way, and that's it. It's part of the natural diversity.
Well, to me, that's I think that's a destructive. I think that's a destructive thing to tell to someone. Not to say that someone has to be cured. People can choose it and become confirmed as homosexuals, and that to me that's not a problem at all, and they deserve every bit of respect and the same rights as any other human being. But if someone wants to explore it psychologically, and there are cases of people who have and feel that they've moved on from it, I think that should be available. And to tell someone that they're just born this way and that's that, to me, that's wrong, because there's no hard proof of that either way.
I hear you. Look, if they wish to go down that journey, because let's say it conflicts with their religious upbringing, then hey, more power to them. But I would venture to you that those who have successfully, shut off their homosexuality, all that they've done is they've stopped their behavior. If you could actually elicit their preferences, I would be willing to bet you the house that their homosexual orientation has not changed, right? So it is true that through, for example, therapy, I could, quote, be taught to no longer have same-sex, behaviors.
It's the fact that a person may feel that there is something about their same-sex attraction that they want to look at psychologically, that there's something about it that they don't feel it's really who they are. In the same way that they may want to look at some other addiction psychologically. Why do they gamble, or why do they have all sorts of behaviors? So you go to a therapist, and you should be able to talk it through. And to have a therapist say, "Well, that's the way it goes. You're born this way, and you better get used to it." I mean, I think that's wrong, because it's actually not scientifically proven that any of these things are born, or that they're ingrained. Wouldn't you agree with that?
of course, they have every right to go and seek the therapy if they desire so, but ultimately, I think accepting oneself for who you are is also a powerful psychological reality. So it's tough to...
I agree with you, but I think that who they are is something that they're trying to discover through therapy.